Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the VCA's first session on climate finance. We are very happy to finally have these sessions happening. This will just be an introduction to climate finance for the VCA and the global and local climate finance mechanisms. And then we'll just go into a little bit of housekeeping for this session. We're just having a few technical moments with our slides. But yes, so just for some housekeeping for the session so that we can all have a very fruitful session and feel safe in the space. Please do ensure that your Zoom tag has your name and your organization on it. So if you have joined from a link, somebody else's link, then their name will appear. And so if you can just click on the three dots next to the name and then click on rename, you'll be able to put your name and your organization's name. And then you can just say hi and tell us where you're from and how you're doing in the chat. And then please ensure to make sure that you mute and stay muted until you've raised your hand and we've said you can speak and ask your questions. And then please feel free to post a question in the Q&A box in your own language. Our interpreters will try their best to translate, or we will also try our best to translate and get your questions answered. If you'd like to make a comment, please do so in the chat box as well, and then raise your digital hand to be part of the discussions. And then in terms of interpretation and support, we have interpretation in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French, and Indonesian Bahasa. Please click onto the interpretation box at the bottom, right at the bottom of your screen, and then click on the interpretation channel that you would require the service from, whether it be Spanish, Portuguese, French, or Indonesia Bahasa. And if you are needing English translation, please stay on the English channel because then you won't be able to hear any of the translation that happens during the session. If you're on the main channel, you only hear the main audio and none of the interpretation. And for any Zoom technical support, please message myself at the South North host or any of my colleagues that have SSN in brackets in their name. Or you could email any questions to info.vca@southnorth.org. So welcome everyone to our VCA Finance Climate Finance Dialogues. This is our first session in a two-part dialogue series. In the first session, we'll be doing an introduction to climate finance mechanisms with local and international mechanisms to give you a mapping of the landscape of climate finance. We will move on to our agenda. Yeah, so we will have the welcome and agenda and the poll. After the agenda, we will have a poll, which will pop up a Zoom poll, and there are about 5 questions that you will answer, and then we'll share the results with you at the end of the poll. After the poll, we will have the overview of the global response mechanisms that will be given by my colleague Michael Gerard, who is facilitating the session, and he'll also be facilitating the second session on the 31st of October. After Michael, we will have a presentation by Maimuna, who will present on the need for local action and access to finances. And then Collins will follow that presentation with an introduction to climate finance mechanisms, both local and international. After Collins' presentation, we will have case study examples of the different forms of climate finance mechanisms. We'll have one from Kennedy Ododa, and I hope I said that correctly. You can correct us when you present, and Joanna Hainana from the EIF. After their presentations, we will have a 30-minute Q&A where you will get to ask your questions, and we will try our best to answer them. Please do, if you do have questions beforehand, type them into the question and answer box, because then we can try and allocate them to speakers as we go. And then after that, we will have our closing comments, outline the next session, and wrap up. So let us try and start the poll. Thank you everyone for sharing that. I see we have a lot of somewhat familiars, but have room to grow. And we hope that in these sessions, we keep growing and building our knowledge and sharing our knowledge around climate finance. So without further ado, I pass on to you, Michael, to start the presentations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leseho. And yes, just to say that a very welcome to everyone from all 4 corners of the world. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. And I'm looking forward to introducing us to a discussion which we'll build out over the 2 sessions. So today is more of a scene setting. We want to get on the same page. It was interesting to note that through everyone responding to the poll, there seems to be people have some level of understanding about climate finance, but there's definitely an appetite to learn more. And there's also some who have a degree of familiarity around the challenges. And we hope that you'll be able to share those with us, particularly in the next session. So the session that will be taking place on the 31st of October, that's the session where we're going to get stuck into a little bit more of the knowledge and learning about challenges and where we can advocate in order to enhance our ability to access climate finance. So today's scene setting, and we really welcome the full agenda of presenters who will be helping us to set the scene. And I'll kick us off with an introduction into the mechanisms that ultimately inform climate finance mechanisms. But I thought I would start with this slide. It's a bit old now, it's about a year old. This was the president of my country, South Africa, coming back from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and very happily sharing the news that that he received 10.7 billion rand, which is about 200. We were very excited that he came back with this idea of having generated money, but ultimately our excitement waned when we realized that it wasn't grants that we were receiving, but ultimately it was loans. And so the questions then raised by this are, who has access to this money? What's it going to be used for? If we're indebting the country and we're indebting the population to repay this money over time, a lot of questions are raised. And this is the kind of thing that climate finance raises for us, and why it's good for us to be having these dialogues and to understand what it is about the way that climate finance is made available and how it's utilized that either makes it part of a story around a transition that is just as we adapt to this changing climate. So let's go to the next slide, and hopefully today we'll begin to answer some of those questions. So this slide, this is the kind of stuff we all know. Over the past 50 years, the global average temperature has increased faster than the past 2,000 years, and CO2 levels are at the highest in at least 2 million years. And ultimately, we're noting the impacts of climate change in many regards. Next slide, please. So where are we globally? Just to give us a snapshot, things are getting hotter. If we look at these trajectories, the warming trajectories that we're on, and we'll see that global average temperature has increased already by about 1.1 degrees from pre-industrial levels, and that the scientists tell us that we are already locked into feeling severe impacts, and that we must act now to avoid catastrophic climate change. And so this graph shows the various scenarios of future temperature that would be reached depending on different levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And ultimately, the severity of the impacts will be lower if the increase in temperature is lower. And in all of these scenarios, the 1.5 degree limit is reached around the early 2030s. So that reality is firmly with us. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this 1.5 degree increase doesn't sound like a lot, but we know that it comes with severe impacts. And ultimately, these impacts will multiply as the climate keeps warming. So we can't afford not to cut emissions, and we really urgently need to take policy and actions to limit our emissions. But also importantly, we are locked into levels of climate change that we will need to adapt to. And so we'll be hearing a little bit from Maimuna in the next presentation around what that adaptation should look like and at what levels that happens. Next slide, please. So given the growing global consensus and recognition of the climate impacts, the Paris Agreement was a landmark moment that was reached in 2015. And it was this commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to keep global temperature increases to below 2 degrees with this aspirational goal of limiting it to 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. And there are several aspects that the Paris Agreement attempts to address the climate challenge through, and that includes the scientific basis and growing that literature, detailing that literature, but also around moving the finances around in order to take action at the respective levels. Next slide, please. But one of the underlying principles of the Paris Agreement is this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, in which the developed nations who, through their historical emissions, have contributed the most to the causes of climate change, have to take some level of responsibility for their emissions, and so there's this commitment for them to contribute to the needs of developing countries who are less responsible, but who are likely to bear the biggest costs and biggest impact. And so trillions of dollars will be needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the agreement stipulates that developed countries should take the lead in providing financial assistance. And that's really the sort of genesis for a lot of climate finance, although that's not exclusively what the term addresses, and that's something that we'll hear a bit more from Collins later in today's session. So next slide, please. The sort of important linkages flowing from the UNFCCC and then ultimately the Paris Agreement is that it results in this mechanism known as NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, in which all members of the agreement commit to producing and sharing their intended contributions, their goals, their goals and their targets for reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, but also their goals on adaptation and how they will build resilience to climate impacts. And so these documents produced at a national level, these NDCs, are really fundamental in the climate change discussion and the climate finance discussion in particular, because much of the climate finance that can be accessed needs to be directed towards addressing the priorities as set by countries in their NDCs. And so that term will come up throughout our discussions. Next slide, please. And really, the NDC is the sort of central policy mechanism which should ultimately be informing and actually be informed by a process of developing various other policies and plans in a country. Two of these examples that I think are useful to us to consider are the National Adaptation Plan that a country will develop, which details much more thoroughly than the NDC what the adaptation needs are of the country and what actions need to be taken, and therefore ultimately where the funding needs to be directed in order for adaptation to happen across various sectors of the economy that will be affected by climate change. So you can be certain there will be sections pertaining to water resources, to agriculture, to various other sectors of the economy. But then also ultimately the NDC should inform, and again be in turn informed by local level planning frameworks, and these look different in different countries, but ultimately things like municipal planning frameworks, so that climate change is also addressed, and not only in the national policy frameworks, but trickles down to a more grassroots level. Next slide, please. And so to facilitate the provision of climate finance, the UNFCCC established a finance mechanism, as they broadly call it, to provide the resources to developing nations, and through which finances from developed nations would flow. And the international mechanisms established under the Paris Agreement are intended to promote the flows of finance and access to resources that will be transformative in the development of the global South. However, these international mechanisms are complex and still emerging, and are continue to evolve. And so this presents challenges in coming to understand how they function, and to establishing the necessary arrangements at a national level and at a subnational level that make it possible to ultimately access these forms of finances in a way that's suitable for the different scales, so at the local level, for example. But those are the kind of challenges that we hope to fully explore over these two sessions that we're having this dialogue over, because the feedback that we gather here is something that we hope can provide the basis for an enhanced understanding of where to advocate, both at a national level and internationally, in order to enhance the flows of climate finance and make climate finance more equitable. So with that, I hope I've set a bit of the scene of the frameworks behind all of this, and hopefully that creates a bit of a vocabulary for us to use as we go on through our dialogue. And with that, I'll hand over to Maimuna from HIVOS, who will speak to us now about the need for local action and access to finance. Thank you. Over to you, Maimuna.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. And yeah, just let me know when it's up and in presentation mode, and then I can start going through it. Good, thank you. All right, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk just a little bit about the need for local action and access to climate finance. As Michael has said, my name is Maimuna Kabatesi. I work at HIVOS, and I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. And yeah, I'll just be talking a little bit about this, but I wanted to first start by just saying a little bit about VCA, Voices for Just Climate Action. I hope we all know which program has enabled us to be meeting here today. So VCA, how we work is we try to present a fair, just, and solution-oriented agenda which integrates social and economic rights into climate action. So we work together as alliance partners, that's Akina Mama wa Africa, Avina, HIVOS, SDI, our Slum Dwellers International, South North, and WWF, and together with our strategic partner, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And we also work, of course, with local civil society organizations. I know a lot of people on the call are representing those organizations, and we want to shape a new reality for people and nature. We bring together global and local voices. I think that came out also in the previous presentation about how can we work at these levels together. And we want to connect a diverse range of civil society organizations or we do connect a diverse range of civil society organizations that represents women, youth, specific needs, urban poor, digital activists, indigenous people, and creatives, and much more. But the reason why I wanted to start by going back into VCA and also talking about some of the goals is to understand why we talk about the need for localizing climate finance. So one of our central goal or ethos is that by 2025, we really see local civil society groups, but also communities claiming a central role as empowered innovators, facilitators, and advocates of climate solutions. And as part of that, what we want to do is to influence climate finance and investments in support of locally shaped solutions for climate adaptation and mitigation. So if you look at VCA globally, this shows just how widespread we are across the globe. So we are working, if I start from the people who are already heading into nightfall, so Indonesia, you can see them on the right of the map, and then we go into Africa, where we are in Tunisia, we're in Kenya, we're in Zambia, and then in Latin America, we are present in Brazil and Bolivia, Paraguay, who work as one country team, and of course in the Netherlands, and we also work at a global level. So within these countries and across these countries, we really see a wide diversity of experiences, of realities when it comes to the impacts of climate change. I've just got a few of these examples up on the screen now, but there's so many more. So on the left, you see somebody in Zambia, and then at the bottom, you see a woman from Kenya. At the top, to the right, you see a woman from Indonesia, and I think at the bottom is a farmer from Uganda. So we are not implementing in Uganda, but we just had the picture available. I just wanted to demonstrate just how, when it comes to talking about adaptation, there is no such thing as one size fits all. All these contexts look completely different. The sociocultural environment is completely different. The reality of the Maasai woman on the bottom in Kenya would be different from somebody, a rural farmer in Eastern Kenya, for instance. And then again, completely different from somebody in Western Kenya, where the environment is completely different and it's not as arid. Again, if you look at indigenous communities with traditional knowledge, there's a lot of realities we have to acknowledge when it comes to what climate change means in terms of impacts and what it means in terms of solutions. So why locally led solutions? We want to make sure that we're being responsive to these communities. And VCA, we advocate for locally led solutions. We also want to counter the common narrative that you hear when you're in some of the global climate spaces, that locally led solutions are not easy to fund because they can't be identified, or they're too small scale or not scalable. And especially this pertains to solutions related to adaptation. So that is a challenge we see in a lot of the countries where VCA is present. Adaptation is the present need because we see a lot of livelihoods being impacted. We see a lot of people suffering because of the impacts of climate change, and adaptation is what's needed for the change for them now. But then there's always this narrative that it's not very easy to fund them. However, locally led solutions have been widely proven to be more effective. And why that is because one, just as I mentioned, it's very important to have solutions that are customized for local communities, and locally led solutions take local context into account. Secondly, it's about local expertise and knowledge. And I think in particular for the way VCA works, we know that traditionally a lot of indigenous people's knowledge, a lot of traditional knowledge that we have got within our communities that we have learned over years and generations is ignored by a lot of the traditional funders of climate finance. But locally led solutions give us an opportunity not only to include, but to actually highlight and platform this traditional and indigenous knowledge into local solutions. And in that way, we end up with solutions that actually do work for the community. There are countless examples all over the world of solutions that were implemented in a top-down manner and did not respond to the community needs and actually ended up making things worse. So when we work from a point that we center local communities and we understand that local communities have got the solutions, then we are going to have solutions that actually work for communities. And finally, locally led solutions have actually been shown to bring in higher social and economic returns for communities. So I've just mentioned a bit of why, because the solutions are actually grounded in the realities and the knowledge of the communities, rather than assumptions that have been made by people who don't exist in those communities or within their realities and their ways of living. In addition, I think one of the other things about locally led solutions is that they really do benefit the most marginalized groups as well. So we see that, of course, when you talk about the impacts of climate change, there are people who experience worse impacts than others. And these people also tend to be the ones, because of our structures, that end up being excluded from actually the solutions. So when we work in a way that we prioritize locally led solutions, we see a lot of benefits for local communities. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we can start to change the environment around this. And I think this is what we are going to be discussing overall. So there is already a climate financing model that has been come up with, but it doesn't tend to be very responsive to the needs of local communities, of indigenous people, of those who are most marginalized. In addition, the current climate financing mechanism tends to be very much driven with financing flowing from the north and coming to the south. And there is a lot of barriers that exclude, in particular, communities and people not organized into formally recognized groups from accessing financing. So changing financing, some of the ways in which you can do this. One, we can start to think about the creation and where necessary and where the mechanisms already existing, the support of mechanisms for participatory funding. So really looking at how do we have funding that actually, even though the funding is coming from one party to flowing to another party, that it's not just a directive of how to utilize this funding, but really an environment and mechanisms that allow for equal participation in the decision-making around this. And just very much connected to that is oversight structures that ensure that local communities are actually driving decision-making. I think this is something that requires not just oversight structures, but really a fundamental change in how we perceive local communities, because there's already an attitude, I think, at national level, you've seen it at subnational level, and of course, definitely at global level, that communities are just meant to be recipients of these funds rather than decision makers around these funds. So there needs to be some attitude change, but there also needs to be structures put in place that enable this decision making being driven by local communities to happen. Next, we need to look at really pushing for concrete targets when it comes to the percentage of climate finance that's actually flowing towards local finance. I think the latest concrete research we have from around 2019 was that about 1 in every $10 is flowing to local climate finance. That's obviously nowhere near enough. We know this because we work with these communities every day. We see the impacts of climate change every day. So we need to make sure that there's concrete targets and high ambition targets to make sure that this finance is flowing to local communities. This should particularly be in place for the bilateral and multilateral funders that channel the most funds to climate finance. But I believe that this is a goal that is relevant for all actors, including our local governments and our national governments in the countries that we work in. Next, we need to think about making the access to financing easier for these local communities. Right now, and I think my colleague will go more into the process and you will see how complex it is. Collins will be speaking soon. But the process, it's not simple, it's not easy to understand, it's not very accessible. And that is particularly true for grassroots organizations, for local communities. It's quite bureaucratic at the moment. It requires a lot of written input. There's not very easy access to information, in particular if you didn't already know about these structures existing. So we need to start thinking about how do we make this access to financing easier? And of course, part of that can be what role do we play as civil society organizations in making that happen? And then the last thing that I wanted to mention, and of course there could be much more, but just very quickly, is alternative financing mechanisms that really ensure that the financing actually does flow to local communities. So a lot of times we see financing, especially in climate finance, it's huge amounts of money flowing in very complex ways. And a lot of times, if a project developer is funded to implement a program in a southern country, even if they don't come from that country, it could still be counted as money flowing to local communities. And I think we need to become more robust about developing financing mechanisms that ensure that this financing is flowing straight to local communities in whatever form that might look like, because it will look very different from a community deep in the Amazon compared to one in Indonesia, compared to one in northern Kenya. So just to think about, especially for us in VCA, what are some of the mechanisms that we can already see potential for and start to support that? So I will keep it here for now, and thank you so much. I'm going to just stop the video so that I can hand over to my colleague Collins to continue.
Thank you so much, Maimuna. And while Collins is lining up his presentation, just to note some of those really key facts around needing to really make climate finance accessible if we want to make the most of local knowledge and expertise, if we want to avoid maladaptation, and we really want to attain impact. And you already did a great job of summing up some of the challenges that especially the international climate finance mechanisms present. And we look forward to hearing more about these challenges, particularly from some stakeholders who have been attempting to implement them. And that will take us into the next session at the end of the month. And we'll do that based on the case studies we'll hear today. So for everyone on the call today, keep tuned, because we'll find out about some case studies today and then get to deconstruct and learn a bit more about the challenges they faced in the next session. And with that, I'll hand over to Collins to take us into a little bit more detail about climate finance mechanisms.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I'll just try to put my presentation up. Just give me a thumbs up or something to.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again for having us. I will present this probably the next 15 minutes and see whether we have some few questions to be able to answer probably within or outside the presentation time. Ideally, what we are going to present within this particular presentation is some of the mechanisms, both local and international, in terms of climate finance that can facilitate climate finance or climate action within our spaces that we are. Of course, these are things that probably, these are instruments that probably we already know, but in case of any particular questions regarding the same, it's always good to be able to ask. One of the things, even as we start, it's good to acknowledge that while we don't have a clear definition of climate finance, but of course, being a practitioner within the field, you always try as much as possible to be able to pinpoint some prescribed kind of definitions within the confines of the convention and the Paris Agreement. And some of that probably comes close to climate finance, referring to local, national, and transnational, or what we call international financing, that are either drawn from the public, private, or alternative sources of financing. And I mean here, philanthropies and the like that seek to support mitigation adaptation actions that otherwise address climate change. Ideally, I know that probably could be limiting, especially with the discussions regarding the new collective quantified goal on finance and encapsulating everything as far as the climate finance definition is concerned. And so probably that will also form part of the discussion that we are going to have as far as climate finance is concerned. However, it's good to also acknowledge that in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities set out in the convention, and in this case, I mean the UN Advocacy Convention, developed parties are to be able to provide finances for developing countries for climate action. The obligation, of course, is affirmed in the Paris Agreement or Paris Agreement, wherein developed countries, while encouraging voluntarily developing countries to be able to provide climate finance, do acknowledge the need that they and the facilitating role that they have in mobilizing climate finance for climate action for developing parties. But it's always good to be able to incline climate finance to specific articles within, of course, the Paris Agreement or the Paris Agreement, especially Article 2 and mostly Article 2 to 1, which probably is the guiding principles as far as knowing what climate finance and what climate finance is not. So the idea is that climate finance needs to be so much consistent with low emissions development pathway, such that, and I'm saying this because there are certain reports that have just come out by Oxfam Shadow Report on climate finance, trying to be able to deconstruct and figure out what was provided, accounted as climate finance and was not climate finance. So the bottom line is that climate finance needs to be consistent with Article 2.1, which is ensuring that these particular finances need to be consistent with low emissions development pathway, because there's a very big gap between, of course, development finance and, of course, climate finance. But it's also good to be able to mention that climate finance needs to also be consistent with Article 3 of the Paris Agreement, which is purely on NDC and facilitating NDC implementation. But of course, as I was mentioning in the first phase, in terms of the definition of climate finance and the overall discussions regarding the new collective quantified goal on finance, there is the aspect of loss and damage and whether this particular finance also accounts as climate finance. So I will leave that for now. I'm not getting into that particular discussion, but I would want that probably to come as a question towards the end of this particular presentation, whether we also need to be able to qualify that as climate finance or probably disaster risk finance. But that is a question that we probably need to answer by the end of the presentation. I know that most of the time we have used instrument and mechanism interchangeably, but I think one of the things that is clearly defined within the convention is, of course, the issue of what climate finance mechanism refers to, and it purely is a way through which developing parties receive funding necessary for climate action, of course, from the developed parties, and parties here, I mean countries. So clearly, in terms of the definitions, again, in Article 11 of the convention, the mechanism for provision of finance resources to developing countries is either on grant or concessional basis, including for transfer of technology. So that is clearly also defined within the convention, that the grant-based basis, or the types of finances that can be able to be channeled through these mechanisms, are either grant-based basis or probably concessional loans in that matter. It also, the article also specifies that the financial mechanism shall function under the guidance and should be accountable to the COP, which of course all of us know, the Conference of Parties, which amongst others decides on the policies, programs, priorities, and eligibility criteria as far as different financing instruments or mechanisms are concerned. To facilitate the provision of finance, the convention established, of course, the financial mechanism to provide financial resources to developing country parties. The financial mechanisms also serves the Kyoto Protocol, and I'm putting this here probably because of the transition period between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement that is, of course, enrolling. So probably having defined what the mechanism is, it's also good to mention, I think this comes in handy, especially after Mona's presentation regarding local actions and access to climate finance, that there is an increasing consideration that climate impacts are felt at the grassroots level and are felt by local communities. And then these particular communities need, predictable, they need readily accessible climate finance to be able to meet their needs as far as climate action is concerned. And so there is, as much as there is an establishment at the international level on what climate finance mechanisms need to be used, there are other establishments, especially at the grassroots level, as far as climate finance is concerned, and probably this is something that we are trying to define, especially with the second pointer, where we are mentioning that given the increasing impact of climate change and the need for local governments, the small island states, the LDCs, or the least developed countries, and other developing countries to be able to action climate change mitigation adaptation, then there are those devolved financing instruments that they probably also need and are currently being established to facilitate climate response in these particular countries or parties, as well as these smaller subnational level kind of areas. So the stemming issues, as far as climate finance is concerned, and this probably also backs the point for creating certain subnational climate finance mechanisms, include, of course, the issues that Mona mentioned, including access, the quality of finance, the quantity of finance, predictability, the decentralization of decision making, the idea of fit for purpose, and again, fit for purpose is relative. So such kind of stemming issues as far as climate finance is concerned are increasingly enabling increasing invention of various local climate finance instruments. And we will see probably by the time that we are ending this presentation, some of the local finance instruments are available for local communities to be able to use and operationalize as far as climate action is concerned. So some of the local climate finance mechanisms, and probably just to mention them, we have, of course, the local climate adaptive living facility, which, of course, most of the time has been called local. And this is established by the United Nations Capital Development Fund, and ideally, it's internationally recognized, and it serves local government and authorities in developing and least developed countries to access climate finance for capacity building, for technical support, and to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, to enhance the adaptive capacity of local communities with climate change. So that is an establishment of, or rather an example of local climate finance mechanism. Most of the time you'll hear probably most of the people call the local instrument. So it's purely a mechanism for local climate adaptation at that particular level. This is international, but at the level of the national governments, we have, of course, something that Kennedy will be talking about, which is the County Climate Fund mechanism, which, of course, Kennedy will be talking about. This is a creation within, of course, the Kenyan government, supported, of course, largely by other consortium and the like, to be able to establish a financing instrument that works for the community. And currently there is a project under the same that is called Financing Local-Led Climate Actions. I think that is what Ken will be talking about. The idea is that this particular financing mechanism is also kind of borrowing largely from the local, or what we call the local climate adaptive living facility, so that the structure is more or less the same, but the idea and the creation is that this particular financing instrument or financing mechanism can be able to support climate action at the local level. And probably Kennedy will get into the depth of trying to explain how the structure within this particular mechanism is, and the instrument that currently is running under this mechanism, which is called FLOCA project, or Financing Local-Led Climate Action project. In terms of, and I'm going to move quite quickly to the International Climate Finance Mechanism. And to set some particular background is that, of course, having defined a climate finance mechanism, the international aspect of climate finance mechanism is that the creation part of it, and this is created at an international level to be able to support climate action within that particular space. It's good to mention that key to this particular finance mechanism is that they either come as grants, concessional loans, or any other form, depending on the type of finance we are talking about. So if you talk about the issue of grants, these are particularly projects that, or rather, these are particularly a mechanism that come based on project and are not to be repaid. So this is purely grant-based finance mechanism, and mostly this comes partially, of course, from GCF. Concessional loans also come from the GCF, yes. And ideally, the idea of having concessional loans most of the time is to be able to attract private sector investors to be able to put in their money in climate action within the global south, if I may. One of the things that we do acknowledge is that ideally climate finance is increasingly shrinking. If you look at the report, especially the 6th IPCC report, there is a clear indication that while climate change impacts are increasing, as presented by Mike in the first slide that he gave in terms of temperatures, and limits to adaptation are being reached, leading to loss and damage, climate finance is increasingly shrinking. And so people are looking at what Maimuna was mentioning, alternative ways of mobilizing climate finance for climate action in the global south. And so concessional loans ideally are to be able to attract private sector investments, but not at the market rates. The idea is that this particular concessional loans can be able to attract at least less rates as far as compared to the market rates for any other given loan. So that is the idea between grants and loans. But it's also good to mention that the grant-based climate finance mechanisms are ideally those projects, those particular finances that are coming to, or are rather mobilized to be able to finance projects that do not have any kind of business cases attached to them. That means that there is no aspect of entrepreneurship that comes with that particular project. And one of such particular grant-based mechanisms that are provided by the GCF, probably when we will be looking at the GCF, is what we call the readiness financing for the GCF, which probably is given to governments to be able to do capacity building, to be able to ensure that policies are in place, establishing of budget tracking and budget coding instruments of such kind. So talking of the GCF, probably the most talked about finance mechanism, GCF, of course, the largest finance mechanism following its establishment in 2012, if I may. The fund, of course, mobilizes finances from developed countries to developing states to address and upscale development tailored to progress mitigation and adaptation to climate change. One of the things probably to be able to mention here is that GCF at its establishment, of course, probably all of us know that it's supposed to be able to finance 50-50 as far as adaptation and mitigation is concerned. However, if you look at the reports, especially the submissions to COP, the Conference of Parties, you realize that until today, GCF is financing largely mitigation projects as opposed to adaptation projects. And probably we need to ask ourselves why and be able to find an advocacy point as far as GCF is concerned. So that at least by the end of, we can give ourselves by the end of 2025, as Maimuna was mentioning, by end of 2025, we had ourselves an objective that by end of 2025, GCF should be able to have a balance between adaptation and mitigation financing. Okay, so it's good to probably also mention that the GCF has 4 categories of project sizes, and these particular project sizes depend on the kind of size of finance that one is applying for. The approval process of the GCF, which I'm not going to delve deep into, is dependent on the kind of size, the kind of project and the size of the project that one is applying for. So we have 4 sizes of projects in the GCF, which is majorly what we call micro, which is some projects below 10 million USD. And these particular projects undergo what we call a SAP approval process or simplified approval process. Most of the time, these are on the go. What you go to a taco, you go to any other place and say, I would want a burger and what have you on the go, and you're given for that kind. And then we have small projects which are between 10 to 50 million USD. Also take some time to be able to be approved. Again, I'm not saying that the approval process is based purely on the size of the project or is based purely on the amount you're applying for. But of course, we also look at issues regarding ESG and the like, or rather the safeguarding, the environmental safeguarding standards to be able to approve projects so far. So depending on where your project is also being implemented, then the GCF will either run through your project to the SAP, or can be able to follow the steps through which, of course, the approval is occasionally or most of the time done. And then we have, of course, the 10 to 50 million small projects. We have the medium projects, which are between 50 to 250 million US dollars. And of course, we have projects above 250 million dollars. One of the things, probably the reason why we are having this discussion regarding the various sizes of the projects of the GCF is that given the sizes of the projects, you realize that the approval process sometimes is lengthy. And this is something that Kenya, given that I come from Kenya, we've been trying to learn from Namibia, because you realize Namibia gets considerably, if I may, a large number of GCF projects. But probably if you look at the sizes of the projects that they also apply for, it's different from the kind of projects and the sizes of the projects that Kenya apply for. So you realize that in terms of scale and those who are doing quote unquote good as far as GCF is concerned, Namibia probably in the continent of Africa could be getting an additional, or rather is slightly above what other countries are doing, probably because of the sizes of the projects that they are doing. But it's also good to mention that besides the sizes of the project, the GCF has a comprehensive gender policy that they use to be able to mainstream gender in terms of finance for climate action. But again, the adequacy is debatable. The structure of the GCF, probably given that it's the largest fund mechanism, it's good to be able to delve deep onto the structure of the GCF, so that at least we have some sort of understanding in terms of who does what at the GCF, so that even if we start interacting with the GCF, then we know the kind of steps that we need to take. But at the Conference of Parties level, we have the guidance that the COP gives to the GCF, and most of the time you can be able to follow the negotiations that undergoes the stream of GCF as far as climate finance is concerned. And the idea is to be able to get a guidance for the GCF board from the Conference of Parties to be able to at least align its practices or its operations. The GCF has the GCF board, which is a key decision making body of the GCF on policies, accreditation, and the project application and approval processes. We have the GCF secretariat, which direct the day-to-day activities of the GCF. Inside the GCF, we have independent evaluation units and the like, but that can be discussed on the other days, as Michael was mentioning. But these particular three bodies within the GCF are quite critical to be able to understand. At the national level, because GCF is keen to be able to implement country-level priorities, the GCF has what we call the national designated authorities. Depending on the country you come from, you'll realize that you are either having it at the Ministry of Environment, others have it at the Ministry or the Treasury, the Ministry of Finance, depending on the country that you come from. So the key primary national contact person to the GCF, of course, is the National Treasury. What they do is that they also endorse or recommend national accredited entities for accreditation to the GCF. But besides the two functions, they also do letters of no objections for the GCF proposals. So before even submitting the proposal, when you're at the concept stage, at least your concept needs to follow up with the national designated authority to be able to give you what we call a letter of no objection to be able to submit your proposal to the GCF, your concept to the GCF, sorry. We have the accredited entities. We have, of course, the GCF AEs are basically the accredited entities, and these are the guys who receive the finances to be able to implement projects, and they are the guys who submit the proposals to the GCF. The executing entities work closely with the accredited entities, so it's more like grant-making process in this particular case, sorry to say, but the accredited entities hold the funds and give them to the executing entities to be able to work directly with the community. So at community level, one of the people that we need to be very close to is the executing entities, so that they are meeting the needs and priorities of communities rather than just creating projects up. Besides the GCF, we have the Global Environment Facility. which is slightly older, of course, than the GCF, and the role of the global environment facilities to support developing countries to prioritize environmental actions that delivers global environment benefits. The Global Environment Facility funds 5 pillared areas, and it's based on multilateral environment agreements, one of which is the Convention of Biodiversity, the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Minamata Convention on Mercury, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, and of course the Convention to Combat Desertification. So the areas of funding for the Global Environment Facility are those particular 5. Just below the screen, you'll see biodiversity, chemicals and waste, climate change, international waters, and land degradation. And they are based on those particular multilateral environmental agreements. The GEF, probably the least understood finance mechanism, has also two sizes of projects. We have, of course, the full size and the medium size, and the process of approval of or development of proposal to the GEF follows through submission, approval, endorsement by the CEO. That is for the full size projects. The actual CEO endorsement, the agency internal approval, and then they submit, they disperse the first tranche to the given applicant, depending on the process or depending on the access entity you're using to be able to get this particular resources. Almost similar. The only difference is that the CEO approval of the project, I'm getting my time. Sorry. So we have almost the same process for the medium-sized projects for the GEF. We have the third and probably the final finance mechanism I'll be delving into this evening, this morning, depending on where we are, is the Adaptation Fund. And the Adaptation Fund purely was set up under the Kyoto Protocol. And you realize that Adaptation Fund has a way that it interlinks with CDM, or Clean Development Mechanism, given that 2% of CDM finances, the CDM finances, probably I needed to mention it in the other slides. But one of the things that happens is that the CDM contributes 2% of its earned resources from, of course, carbon emission reductions to take to adaptation finance, and the adaptation finance uses this particular 2% to be able to action purely adaptation. You realize that CDM is mitigation based, but now it's getting some money from mitigation to be able to finance adaptation. But apart from this particular 2% that CDM contributes to adaptation, is that Adaptation Fund also draws in some bit of mobilization or pooling from country parties which are developed, if we may. Access to the Adaptation Fund is probably two-way. So we have direct access modality, where parties can submit their projects through a direct access entity. In Kenya, probably we have what we call NEMA, National Environment Management Authority. And then, and they are also the national implementing entity, so to say, of Adaptation Fund. And so you can give your proposal through that particular national implementing entity, which qualifies as a direct access entity. Alternatively, if a particular region, for instance, the East Africa region, would wish to submit their proposal to the Adaptation Fund, even that is, if they do qualify as member states or parties to the Adaptation Fund, then they can be able to do that through what we call the sub-regional entities as implementing entities in lieu of the national implementing entity. But then there is the other access modality which you can be able to use, which is purely multilateral implementing entity. So parties can go through a multilateral implementing entity, probably FDB, to be able to access the Adaptation Fund for Climate Action. But NIE or MAE, and that I mean the National Implementing Entity or the Multilateral Implementing Entity, should be able to meet the financial standards established by the Adaptation Fund Board. They should be able to guarantee that the financial management will be done in a way of integrity. institutional capacity, they should be able to at least give a clarity that their institutional capacity is up to date, guarantee transparency, self-investigative powers and anti-corruption measures, bear full responsibility of the overall management of the projects, and carry out financial monitoring and reporting responsibilities. This is how the approval process and the project cycle looks as far as adaptation fund is concerned. So you submit your proposal for a program. It goes under screening. It goes under review by the project program committee. Decision is made. Contracting is done. The project implementation and monitoring by the implementing entity. That is after the disbursement. So you monitor and then you submit reports on an annual basis. I want to stop there and be able to return this to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Collins. I think that your presentation did a fantastic job of highlighting just this complexity of the climate finance discussion. We have both the local climate finance mechanisms, which run through your government, run through a government department. The source of that finance might be the national fiscus. It might come from the national budget directly, or it may have come from an international donor, perhaps through a one-on-one arrangement between a particular developed country and a developing country. And that finance then enters into government programs of sorts and would be accessed in a sense directly by organizations in the country interfacing with some form of government agency. And then on the other hand, these very elaborate and complex international climate finance mechanisms, which require that organizations, although need to work with government to make sure that their project ideas are aligned with the priorities of government, are aligned with things like the NDCs and the national adaptation plans, but they would actually access that finance, or finances and resources would flow towards projects not through government, but instead through intermediaries who have been accredited to play the role of this intermediary for a particular fund. And that creates quite an elaborate, quite a complex system, one in which the scale of effort required to access the funding is quite different from potentially the capacity of organizations who are working at the grassroots level. And so this is some of the mismatching that we currently see as taking place in the system. But just to highlight some of the terminology that we might hear in the next two presentations, is that term accredited entity and executing entity. So these two forms of intermediaries that are two-step removed from where the climate finance originates, and what complex processes are involved to propose a project and ultimately get it financed. I think with that, noting that something like the GCF has a micro project at $10 million, one thinks any organization on the ground would love to be able to access $10 million as a micro project, but micro is the requirements for accessing that $10 million are still extremely complex and have to flow through these executing entities who have established a relationship with the particular climate finance mechanism. So for example, with the GCF, and have proven a track record of being able to handle that amount of money, have the due diligence mechanisms in place to make sure that the money is guarded and utilized correctly. And so that creates this sort of multi-level structure before the money can actually be accessed on the ground. But in order to give us more of a concrete example to go by, we'll now hear from Kennedy, who will be telling us a little bit more about a local climate finance mechanism in Kenya. So over to you, Kennedy.
Thanks so much. Maybe you can share my screen. So good afternoon, good evening all. My name is Kennedy Ododa from Adaptation Consortium. I'll be sharing a mechanism that was conceptualized by Adaptation Consortium, which is a partnership of organizations working closely with government entities. So the mechanism focus was to build an effective climate resilience in Kenya. And the mechanism is known as County Climate Change Fund that supports subnational entities to create, access, and use climate finance from different sources with the aim and goal of building climate resilience and reduce vulnerability to changing climate in a more coordinated and planned way. On it, there were guiding principles which aligned to the LLF principles. There were community-driven bottom-up planning processes, and it was anchored and supporting the decentralization and devolution process in Kenya. And then it allowed for flexible learning and learning approaches, and focused was on an inclusivity to ensure there is a national value and principles of governance. And also the focus was on local investments or local climate solutions that supports communities as opposed to few individuals. So this mechanism was born on the need to have a structured collaboration between public and private actors so that ideas, expertise, and finance can be coordinated to design and also institutionalize these systems to ensure that local climate solutions are established and operationalized in a coordinated way. Also, in Kenya, there was need to ensure that there is effective mainstreaming of climate information into plans, and also enhancing public participation into government planning processes. Also, there was need to have a predictability and continuous flow of funding to local communities, and this was key and viable through government budgets. And the local solutions that resulted, there was need that they reflect local or community priorities to ensure there is aspect of sustainability and equitable benefits, and then opinions of different segments of the communities were sought and was a priority as the climate solutions were sought of. So that was the basis and the background that born the developed climate finance in Kenya. This happened over a decade ago, and through the piloting lessons, learning, sharing on the opportunities, it's being scaled in Kenya across other subnational governments through the support of national treasury and national programs like local. So what did it purpose to build? The importance of the County Climate Change Fund mechanism, which is an aspect of devolved climate finance to the subnational governments, was to ensure that there is a predictable financing system. So that was only viable and possible through having legal structure and frameworks and standards that facilitates flow of climate finance, not only from the national bit and international bit, but also from the local bit. So these subnational governments put up legislations that even allows donations and levies to flow into that pot to ensure that local climate solutions are actioned. also, there was need to ensure that public participation is enshrined in the processes, not only to inform the community, but there was also need to empower them and involve them into deciding on what really climate solutions really meant to them at that local level, so that there's that social inclusion and accountability and transparency in it. Also, the mechanism supported need to ensure that as communities, as locals, make decisions on what they want in terms of local climate solutions, then they make informed decisions because they are able to internalize and use routinely climate information that is coordinated and passed across for household consumption. So they make climate resilient decisions not only at the community level and also at the household level. Also, to ensure that the communities improve and become more resilient, they will need to strengthen aspect of learning and reflection at the local level, so that there was also an aspect of monitoring and evaluation as a component of CCCF. So in the design of CCCF, the focus was on 4 components. And being components, Adaptation Consortium and its partners of a decade of learning and reflection realized that for an effective community resilient building, there's need to have all the systems operating effectively. The first bit is the fund. The fund is designed in terms of anchored in the laws and capitalized from a variety of sources. Like I've talked about county budgets, there's also National Climate Change Fund aspect. Now that's now where the FLOCA comes in, because it's a national fund with different donors inputting money on that fund. International and domestic partners can also support that fund. And then it was deliberate that a good number of percentage of that funds are or is allocated towards community level investment to fund climate solutions, with a smaller percentage remaining at county level to support subnational level. I mean now to support subnational level climate investments, because climate change knows no boundaries, but there can be some issues that cuts across different communities. And then in it, what worked well also during the pilot was that communities were informed of that fund, the amount that was available in that pot, to ensure that when they do their plans and budgeting, they know the amount that is there. And then there were also the second component relates to the structures, where we have the subnational level structures just to manage the mechanism. And then there is the local level structures, which is the central pillar of the mechanism, because they are the link between the households or the communities to the governments. They organize community discussions, they organize community reflections, they organize community prioritization of climate solutions. And then at that higher level, the subnational level, is where we have technical experts with from different fields, and some are co-opted just to support the central pillar of the mechanism, which is the word climate change community planning, climate change planning committees. Then the issues of climate information and resilient planning tools. Like I said earlier, communities are empowered to use resilient planning tools to identify key elements to assess their status, climate risks, so that they build their resilience from an informed decision. And this was also a critical part, and what Adaptation Consortium and its actors and partners worked also on was to ensure that there is an integration of traditional and modern thoughts or information flow, that is climate information, so that there is a system and structure on how this information reaches the communities. And that's why Adaptation Consortium worked closely with the Kenya Meteorological Department, so that the subnational governments have what is called climate information services plans. The last bit of the components is the part of monitoring and evaluation, so that there is an effective way of learning. Communities learn by doing approach. They test, reflect, and adjust as situation change. And also there can be aspects of cross-community learning, cross-subnational learning, and exchange forums, so that best practices are improved and scaled out and shared across communities. So for Adaptation Consortium, the mechanism was more than a pot of money. It has those 4 components to ensure and reinforces a participatory approach where the decisions are devolved at the local level. And in that local level, the communities participate in identifying who their leaders are, and those leaders participate in engaging the communities in consultations. So they don't even make a unanimous decisions, but communities, they just do an organization of communities for consultations purposes, and ensures that in that lower level, different groups are part and parcel, the marginalized communities, the minorities, youth, women, persons living with disabilities, faith-based organizations, public interest organizations are part and parcel of that central pillar of the mechanism. And during each consultations, these key segments of the populations are engaged, and their needs and demands are catered for during implementation. And also the committees lead, like I've talked, they lead in also ensuring there is integration of local knowledge, and climate information is also integrated in the process. So how did or the plan and how the CCCF managed and ensured that climate finance flows? Like I've talked of the 4 pillars, the key one is the fund. And the fund and the structures are anchored in a legislation, so that there is authority and there is legality into who leads the community and who manages the funds. So like you can see in my chart there on how the knowledge is flow from the local, because local knowledge is so critical in climate resilience building, and how the fund flows, decisions and choices of what the community really needs flows, and also the aspects of oversight and technical support. So World Climate Change Planning Committee, is the local lowest level in Kenya, are the central pillars of the process, and that's where also the community ideas, the local knowledge that is integrated into the modern thinking for the resilience building are born from the households, and then they move to the committees, and then that up to the county planning committee, which is just also established under the law, but manages the mechanism, and it consists of technical persons from different sectors that are critically affected or impacted by climate change. Public good investments relates to that local investments that the community agree on and supports most of their needs, including ensuring that all segments of the population's interest are part of that investments. And you see now that with that structure, global climate finance flows, finance from the national treasury, that is the national funds, also flows to the community. County budgets are also allocated there. Donations are allocated there. And during the pilot, 90% of all that fund was used to build, to support local climate solutions. And then 10% was used for administration. Like I indicated earlier, because in a sub-county level, there are different communities, and at times in that sub-national level, there might be a sub-national level investment. So some of the monies are retained just to support that sub-county level investment, but most are used for local climate solutions. So CCCF, that is the Devolved Climate Finance Mechanism that is currently under scale in Kenya, is aligned and supports the LA principles, with key being empowering citizen voice and strengthening the government and citizen interaction. Like I've said, that the communities through the ward planning committee, which are the central pillars, are empowered to make climate related decisions, to lead the communities into consultation and identifying and climate solutions. And also they are able to do bankable proposals just to support the local decisions. It's also an avenue to strengthen government-citizen interaction, because communities engage closely now at that level with the government actors. And at the pilot phase, there were manuals or even how to call a government representative in their meeting, just to elaborate a technical issue for the committee to understand. Also, the mechanism, like I've indicated earlier, supports participatory bottom-up planning, ensuring that communities are involved and are at the center stage on determining what needs to be done at which particular time, and routinely. And also the local institutions is critical in ensuring that there's knowledge enhancement across the localities, so that there is issues of addressing vulnerability and poverty in it. So that's basically a summary of how and what the mechanism that is being scaled out in Kenya entails. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kennedy. It was really interesting to hear about this very unique way in which climate finance has devolved down to the local level. I think there's a lot to take from this project and what it's been able to achieve, and certainly the lessons it's learned along the way, setting out to make sure that action at the ground level can be locally led and inform the design of parts of the investments that are made, and then to ensure that there's some form of predictability of the availability of funds, and that it was required that in order for there to be predictable access to funds, there's an integration of climate finance of this kind into local budgets, local financing arrangements that could be applied for, but that all needed to be underpinned by new legislation so that it could be abided by, and that it also seemed to rely on putting aside resources to build local capacity, both in the part of the role players within government now at a local level having to use and operate a new system, and also those community members who would need the capacity to engage in the process and inform. So I think with that, knowing that people will likely have lots of questions, and also just to remind everyone that we'll be examining lessons from this project in the next session at the end of the month. I'll hand over now to Johanna from the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia, and we'll be sharing our screen for that one. And Johanna will take us through an example of international climate finance and how that is operated by the EIF. So I'll hand over to you, Johanna.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. My name is Joanna Hainana, coming from the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia. And yeah, for those that don't know where Namibia is, it's a semi-arid country just right on top of South Africa. And as I said, it's a vast land, it's a vast country with less or low population. Our population is less than 3 million people. And because of the uniqueness of where we are, we have a desert, Namib Desert. I'll be tackling the project that has been implemented by the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia with finance coming from the GCF. Just to also give you a background, the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia is an accredited entity to the Green Climate Fund, and that's why we'll be diving into that. Okay, just to give you a brief background, the pictures that are being displayed on my slide, the very first slides, are just indicating to you on some of the initiatives that the project has come up with the relevant beneficiaries, and I'll be taking you through as we go through the slides. Emanating from the vulnerability assessment report done by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry and Tourism in Namibia in 2012, there was a need that was derived from that report that needed to consider our most vulnerable communities that resides in gazetted communal conservancies as well as community forests that are facing adverse effects of climate change, and there was a need for them to be assisted with strategies as well as mechanisms put in place in order to enhance their resilience to the effects of climate change. And that's why when the EIF got its accreditation in 2016, beginning of 2016 by the GCF, the Ministry of Environment and Tourism as our national designated entity gave the mandate to the EIF to draft a proposal for our communal conservancies registered and as well as communal forest communities that are residing in those two areas to sort of like get them funding to help them implement some of the projects that I'll be taking you through as we go through the slides. Okay, I might also indicate to you that the conceptualization of this project proposal, it was not an easy way, and I actually acknowledge Barbara's comment to say that some of these funding mechanisms are really not working for local SOEs, and as was indicated, we will have a session whereby we will have one of the beneficiaries come to this call and just inform the House on what type of lessons and challenges they have embarked on or they have encountered as they were implementing some of these projects. Okay. So the EIF conceptualized the project proposal for about 3 months, and then it submitted it to GCF. And then it also took about 3 months for GCF's approval. And then only because the EIF got accreditation beginning of 2016, and then the board of GCF only approved the project proposal towards the end of the year, that is October 2016. But then still, because we were also learning as EIF on how to adapt and putting our policies in place to ensure that they also adhere to the GCF criteria. the project only materialized or only commenced in beginning or towards the end of 2017, whereby we kicked off with some project inception meetings, as well as creating awareness to the beneficiaries, training them on what is expected of them as for them to benefit to this project. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the project title, I forgot to mention earlier, it's Empower to Adapt. It's creating climate change resilience to our rural communities that are residing in those areas that I've indicated, registered communal conservancies, as well as community forest. So what was the problem? Why did we had to look for funding? Why didn't we use like the local funding as the previous presenter has indicated? Of course, Namibia is a developing country and is posed with so many challenges emanating from resources as well as knowledge on how to implement some of the effects of climate change, as well as put up strategies that would benefit its citizens. That's why there was a need for us to present a proposal that could access funding on behalf of our communities. That could be, and that's why we had gotten funding internationally from GCF. Of course, our beneficiaries were posed by the threats of climate change, such as drought, wildfires, flooding, loss of biodiversity that resulted in water shortage, food security, income security, diseases, and life-threatening conditions. As I indicated, I will be mentioning on some of the projects we have embarked on, we have funded under this project. But then just to give you a brief background is that when you are posed with, say, for example, flood, and you are living in a floodplain, we have most of our communities that resides in floodplain because of maybe they depend on the agricultural benefits that they receive at that area. So when it's flooding, they need to move to higher lands in order for them to actually save their livelihoods. And that's why some of this migration from lowland to highland causes or pose life-threatening conditions. Okay, and why was the project then intended, or why was the project solution intended at looking at our communities or enhancing the adaptation of our communities' livelihood? It's because, as the previous presenter have indicated, GCF has funded most of mitigation projects, but then unfortunately, adaptations projects are not so funded, and therefore the country looked at in a level of whereby we encourage adaptation projects within our beneficiary, as well as giving them alternative livelihood options for climate change adaptation strategies, as well as technologies. The project was being implemented under 3 investment windows, which is climate resilient agriculture, climate-proof infrastructure, as well as ecosystem-based adaptation. So for projects that were looking at climate-resilient agriculture, we're looking at innovative resilient farming systems such as hydroponic systems, greenhouses with drip irrigation, and that takes you back to my picture that I indicated there, that we were encouraging people to be self-sufficient when it comes to food security. Backyard gardening with focusing on vegetable production. We are residing in a desert, as I indicated, and also livestock breeding. And then with regards to the climate-proof infrastructure, we were looking at projects that are addressing the vulnerability of our communities' household within the respective settlement through infrastructure adaptation, introduction of renewable energy technologies, and water saving mechanisms. So for some of the remote areas of Namibia, we have what we call boreholes to provide water for these communities. But most of these water boreholes are actually pumped, or they are the energy that provides the pump with functioning is diesel, which is not so environmental friendly. So what we did under this project is that we retrofitted or rehabilitated those boreholes, removing the diesel with renewable solar energy. Okay, and then for the third window is the ecosystem-based adaptation, whereby we were enhancing resilience and maintenance of ecological functions and ecosystems at the landscape level through fire management interventions, forest inventories, as well as improving our grassland and rangelands within those respective areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so how was the project financed? This is the first of its kind. It's a pilot project, not only in Namibia, but also worldwide. It was funded under the GCF modality of enhanced direct access. It's a modality that actually enhance or look at ways of exploring funding directly to our beneficiary, unlike the normal way of whereby donors will provide funding to a third party or somewhere, maybe an NGO, and then the NGO implement the projects on behalf of the beneficiary. So the EDA modality is removing that aspect of saying, okay, fine, much funding has been directed already to third parties to implement projects on behalf of our communities. Why don't we send the money directly to our beneficiaries and see if they can implement their own projects that are self-driven? Our proposals, the proposal that were funded under the 3 investment windows that I've indicated, were self-driven by the communities. They were the ones that drafted their own proposal. As funding from GCF and EIF, we only provided training to them as potential beneficiaries and what type of projects they could come up with, but they were at liberty of them drafting their own proposal and submitting it to the EIF, so we would fund directly the activities. The grant sizes ranged between $50,000 to a maximum of 400,000, and we have funded about 31 grants as opposed to the 33 grants that were initially the project was looking at. That is due to the fact that most of the projects were requesting large amounts, so we especially for the ecosystem-based adaptation, because they were looking at a large landscape, and as indicated, Namibia has a vast land, so much funding was channeled through that component, and therefore we could not attain to the 33 grants that were supposed to fund. Okay, the financial players were the funder, the GCF. EIF is an accredited entity, mainly served as also as an executing entity to just receive funding through us as an accredited entity and send it directly to the beneficiary. So the only benefit that the EIF got from here is the 10% project management fee that they received as we implementing, and they are hosting the PMU, and the money was directly channeled through to suppliers. 90% of the money that the grants that were awarded to the beneficiary were paid directly to suppliers. They collect the infrastructure and whatnot, and then they implement. And then they only received about 5% for their own project management. So that's the arrangements within the fund that made sure that the funds were really used for the intended purpose. Okay, why was the finance, or why was the EDA modality deemed necessary to fund? It's because we thought, or the government indicated, or they have done assessment and have actually, their reports have actually indicated that our communities that are on the ground are the most affected by the effects of climate change. And then it was deemed necessary that the money that is directed directly to those that are affected, and that where the money is really needed, instead of us channeling it through third parties. Okay, as indicated, the beneficiaries are also organized into institutions. As I indicated, they are gazetted institutions, registered, that have financial management policies in place, could be audited also, and they are responsible to reporting directly to the government. So it was easier for us to sort of monitor the progress of projects, as well as document their implementation as part of our national determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. Okay, next slide. I think that's the last one. Yes, thank you very much, unless there are any other questions that I have omitted.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joanna. I think what we heard here was really about the genesis of this project coming from the vulnerability mapping that had been undertaken at the national level. And so there's this link that I pointed to in the beginning between national planning processes like the NDC setting or the National Adaptation Plan and any vulnerability assessments that are undertaken to inform those policies, how a project like this needs to be based on something that's come out of government's set of priorities and that identification of the vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed, ultimately leading to the identification of the communities specifically that needed to benefit in the form of these conservancy communities and forest communities. We also heard that, which I think everyone on the call is probably now getting a real sense of just how complex it is to develop and have proposals approved by particularly the International Climate Finance process, and why that is, that it's not easy for grassroots organizations to have the capacity to do that, and why it needs to be, in a sense, devolved down to a more local level. In the Kenyan example, eventually into local budgeting processes at the county level. In the case of the EIF themselves playing this intermediary role with then direct contact with these registered communities in order for the finance to flow more directly. But it's still a complex process and takes many years. I believe at the moment it takes up to 3 years to get a project approved by the GCF. And then we heard specifically around this enhanced direct access modality that the EIF was implementing. And I think what was critical there was how it sought to empower the grassroots organizations, the community organizations, to develop their own proposals and speak to their own priorities and needs. And the EIF's job in that regard was to capacitate them and provide the resources for training and building their ability to do the project development, so that they could develop a project that was in alignment with what the fund was established for. So that was really insightful and gave us, I think, 2 really good examples that we will continue to look at in the following dialogue happening on the 31st of October. And so any questions around particularly the challenges and the obstacles that were faced along the way for both these examples will be addressed in detail, and we will hear from some of the beneficiaries themselves. Those community beneficiaries will join us, and we can hear from them firsthand what some of those challenges were, and we're going to have a very frank and open discussion, because as you can see, all of this is a new and fast evolving space, and we're all learning together. But in order to make sure it's all clear in your minds as the basis of further discussion, we'll have just 10 minutes now. If there are any questions that haven't yet been answered in the Q&A, or if anyone wants to follow up with one of their questions, please do raise your hand. We'll then acknowledge you. You can ask a question to anyone who presented today if you'd like any more clarity on this context setting that we've tried to put forward. So please do go ahead and raise your hands, and I'll ask our team in the background to note who those people are and to let us know who can come off mute. Let's see, Precious.
Yes, my question goes to Miyamuna. I think she presented about the structures, the economic structures, and I was wondering, she mentioned oversight structures. How do they ensure the oversight structures that support local decision making? What would that look like?
Excellent question. Maimuna, would you like to take that?
Yes, sure. Just to answer, I think that, sorry, I did not see who asked the question. It's not very easy to say what could work or not work, but I could give an example of like some of the measures that I know I've been hearing in the climate space. So for instance, there was in the renewable energy sector, there used to be a lot of challenges with projects that would come in, be implemented in a community, but did not have benefit for the community. This would be like decentralized renewable energy projects. So they were envisioned to come in to kind of bring economic empowerment, more energy access and equity around energy access, but they were implemented by developers from different countries and different continents. And they've led to a lot of issues where these projects have been implemented on land that is considered sacred land by indigenous communities. They've been implemented in ways that harm rather than support local communities. And so Chile actually changed their whole policy and regulatory framework around the implementation of these renewable energy projects. And one of the things they did was that they changed it from, project developers who would come in and have to basically carry out a process and then at the end say, and we've talked to the community and everything has been checked and it's approved, to a process where now it's the community that actually has to present the proposal to the government for approval. So when you've got this policy and regulatory environment in which the community is actually put in the driver's seat, you see a change in the attitude of developers, you see a change in the community because they are now really empowered. And it's not a cosmetic shift, it's really a complete turnaround of how this used to work to enable communities to actually be in the driving seat. So this meant that even when it came to things like revenue sharing, the community has already been privy to all the discussions. A lot of times when you see revenue sharing, communities don't actually know how much the revenues are, how much the accounting can be very vague or murky. But when you've got a policy and regulatory environment that changes things in this way, you see the community is actually able to take the driver's seat to agree on things, even like how our community is going to be supported to be part of these projects, and not like only at the lowest levels, but also be able to progress and gain this capacity to work on this kind of more technical projects. So there's ways in which this can be done. This is obviously like because this was a shift in an entire country due to years of these kinds of projects not working. But it can also work in other ways, like if we think about how do we make this information accessible. So if a project developer or a financier posts something on their website, but I'm a woman living in Northern Kenya and I've only got like I guess what we call a dumb phone now, not a smartphone, I can't access the internet. Maybe I never went to school and learned how to read. How do you make sure that this information is shared in a way that communities can understand, internalize, and then make changes and comments on things like this? So those were just some of the things that I was thinking of, but of course there's a lot of different ways this can be implemented depending on the country and the context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamona. And I think that last point you made around accessibility and understandability for the local level is it's related to the point that Celine raised in her Q&A. But I see, Celine, you've got your hand up. So would you like to ask another question?
Only if I'm not hogging the space. If there's another hand, they should ask it because I've had my question.
I didn't see another hand. I think you're the top of the list.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to commend both Kennedy and, sorry, who's the girl who just spoke?
Joanna.
Memuna. Yes, both of you, I think, make the point, which is very important, of it's not just about finance, but how do you create parallel institutional architectures that actually allow for the finance and decision making to go hand in hand. So it's no use having the finance in a country if poor communities don't have a seat at the table to be able to prioritize what these projects are and work with their local government and local engineers on these things together, so that it is a solution both for the city and for the community. And so there are many benefits of that, especially when you're dealing with very uncomfortable issues and negotiations with the city, like housing and land tenure and evictions. Climate becomes like a nice cushioning for us to be able to begin to engage at this institutional level, and we should really open the space for that. My next one is actually a question, Michael, and this has always been going on in my head for the last 3 years when I listen to all these conversations on climate finance. Why is it that we are all the time looking at the North for giving us money to the South? And this seems to be like creating an inertia, like we're all waiting for them to give to us something. And, are there no other, that could be one route, but we don't have to wait for them forever. Are there other ways to do this? Have people experimented with other things? And really, why do we let our government scot-free? And more the pollution and all the things that's happening is happening as much in the global South as in the global North. And in fact, global North is now improving over time, but the global South continues to be pollutants especially big countries like India, China. So is there a way to hold these governments accountable? Because, we cannot just say we're going to wait for money from the North forever. And it really creates an inertia.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's, especially when it comes to predictability and reliability. And so what the Kenyan government tried to do by devolving accessibility to specific funding for climate finance, for climate initiatives to the county level was an attempt to make it more predictable and institutionalized, as opposed to this sort of piecemeal one project here and there that takes 3 years to be approved kind of a process for international climate finance. But certainly, funding that it received in order to make that project happen, as in set up the institutional frameworks, revise the legislative environment, it would be interesting to find out where that funding came from. But there's nothing that would stop a country from creating similar frameworks. And in fact, the integration of climate action and climate planning into the existing budgets, let's say, of a municipality, to try and take the conversation down to a kind of a grassroots level. We could say that if a local municipality is planning their budget in a way that is responding to climate change, the money that they would spend in a way that would potentially lead to maladaptation, or in a way that would be wasted should climate shocks come along and let's say interfere with the functioning of certain infrastructure, would be wasted money. And so it's really imperative that that planning and budgeting process at a local level even is already inclusive of the climate action that's needed. And that's a space where I imagine, where advocacy should be targeted, because that seat at the table, that voice in the conversation, should be happening when there's a planning process that's held by local governments to inform the budgeting, and that should, as you say, stand completely separate from any special projects and special money that comes the country's way through climate finance. And so that level of accountability is something that I think grassroots organizations can band together to promote in their countries, that they have a voice in the conversation with local planning and local budgeting. And then the other aspect is corporates. Of course, what are they doing? And there is the evolving ESG environment where companies are no longer, especially your big companies, required to report only on profits and losses, but also on their environmental and their social impact. And what do those frameworks look like, and which companies have taken decisions to pursue that honestly, and which are not, and just using greenwashing. And so if there's organizations that, if there are companies that are not living up to that responsibility of being a responsible citizen, a responsible corporate citizen, then that's another area where grassroots organizations can try to advocate and hold them to account, because how they spend money matters in the value chains. For example, how they spend money matters when it comes to what resources they use and the outputs of their processes. All right, any other questions? Okay, well, that's us for time. Thank you, everybody. I think it's been a wonderful opportunity to frame what is a very complex topic. I hope that you benefited from the framing that was provided by all of our wonderful guest speakers, and that these two examples will continue to serve us in the next session as we take a deeper dive into how they've been implemented and the lessons that can be drawn from there. So thank you all for your participation. Thank you, and we look forward to the next session.